This is the vivo V25 Pro, the latest smartphone in Vivo's V series, which mainly focuses on stylish and eye-catching exterior designs, as well as a good camera system for capturing slices of life, especially selfies and portraits. So for around $479, is the vivo V25 Pro worth this price? Let's find out in this video. Beginning with the unboxing experience. As you can see, we've got the phone itself in a beautiful blue shade. Most importantly, it can actually change colors, but I'll have to get to that later. Other than a phone, we have a transparent case that's pretty strong in comparison to other default cases, and it feels like it can really protect the phone during accidental drops. We also get a user manual, nothing special here, a 66-watt charging brick that supports Vivo's flash charge, a Type A to Type C cable, a pair of 3.5mm wide earbuds, which is something you don't see every day, a SIM ejector, as well as a Type C to 3.5mm headphone jack converter. And that's pretty much it. The thing I like the most about the V25 Pro would be the back that changes colors. Basically, the phone is supposed to have a bluish cyan color to it. I think Vivo calls it serving blue. But if you put the phone outside on a sunny day, the ultraviolet light from the sun will make the back of the phone start to change colors. Let me demonstrate for you. So now the phone has a cyan color. Now we have a deep ocean blue color. Honestly, I feel like this is a signature feature for V series, and it makes the phone so much more interesting to use in daily life. Every time you pick up the phone, you are likely to see a different shade of blue, which just makes the user experience so refreshing. Also, I do like how Vivo has decided to limit the two color inside the blue hue range. If you still remember the V23 Pro, that phone has a yellow back that changes to a greenish cyan color, which is kind of cool, but it will probably give you a hard time if you accidentally lose your phone and need to describe its color, right? Now, since cyan and deep blue are kind of similar, you could just say that it's a blue phone. Simple. But if you plan to use a phone case anyway, well, I guess Vivo has to come up with some color-changing phone case as well. As for the rest of the design language, it's pretty similar to the predecessors. On the front, we have a selfie camera in the middle, and the screen has a curved edge on both sides, which creates a unibody look that's comfortable to hold in hand. On the back, we have a camera module that sticks out a little bit, and we can see the popular dual ring design once again, but a glossy glass panel does create more contrast on the back. The whole phone weighs around 190 grams and measures in at 8.62mm thick, which is on the light side for phones with a relatively big screen. Speaking of the screen, let's move to the front of the phone and talk about the display. The V25 Pro has a 6.56-inch 1080p AMOLED display with a resolution of 2376 by 1080, supports DCI-P3 color space, and a 120Hz refresh rate. In other words, the phone has a pretty solid display for most use cases out there, and watching online videos is quite enjoyable on this phone. Speaking of the 120Hz refresh rate, this does create a better user experience when scrolling through social media or web pages. However, it seems like the phone only switches to 120Hz when swiping between app pages. So if you want the best scrolling experience possible, then you have to turn off Smart Switch and select 120Hz. Also, keep in mind that manually selecting 120Hz will reduce battery life since it consumes more energy. Powering the V25 Pro is a 4830 mAh battery, which is a little bigger than the standard 4500 mAh battery found in other phones. This should be enough for daily use, unless you plan on taking photos and playing games 16 hours a day. If you do plan on that, then I guess almost no other batteries could last that long. The good news is, if you do run out of battery, you can charge your phone up to around 70% in 30 minutes, since the V25 Pro supports Vivo's 66-watt flash charge technology. As for the processors, we have a MediaTek Dimensity 1300 chipset inside with a maximum 12GB of RAM, which can handle most tasks out there. For intense gaming, I would say this device is playable, but you just need to turn down some of the graphics settings. For Genshin Impact, I turned all settings to medium and set the frame rate to 45 frames per second, and the game ran just fine. So I'd say that for casual gaming, it's no problem. Now let's talk about the other main focus of the V25 Pro, and that is the camera system. First, let's go through the camera specs. On the back, we have a 64-megapixel main wide camera with optical image stabilization, an 8-megapixel ultra-wide lens, a 2-megapixel macro camera that honestly 99% of users won't care, as well as a 32-megapixel front-facing camera. Starting with the main wide camera, I would say it's pretty decent, especially if you're just capturing slices of life. The photos coming out from the main cameras are sharp, with good contrast and white balance. However, even though the main camera has a 64-megapixel sensor inside, the photos that you get are only 16 megapixels if you do not activate 64-megapixel mode manually. So, now the question becomes, is the 64-megapixel mode that much better than a normal mode? Let's find out. Here's a comparison between the two modes. It's clear that a 64-megapixel mode has a sharper image with more details, while the other just has too much artificial sharpening. But that's not the full story here. Because while you do get more pixels using the 64-megapixel mode, you also lose a lot of the post-processing done by the phone. In this comparison, we can see both images are equally sharp, but the 64-megapixel mode has a lot more digital noise, since there's less processing done by the phone. So it just depends on if you're willing to sacrifice one for the other. As for video, the main camera supports optical image stabilization, as well as electronic image stabilization. So let's see how they perform in the real world. When we turn off any stabilization, the footage is very shaky, just as expected, as if someone drank too much coffee in the morning. When we switch to the standard stabilization using OIS, we do get quite a smooth video, which is pretty impressive. Looking at the footage, it seems quite okay in the first place. But when we take a look at the distant buildings, we get a kind of wobble effect that makes you feel like a little dizzy. And the same happens on Ultra Stabilization mode using both OIS and EIS. This effect usually happens when the digital stabilization has been turned up too high, and this is something that can be fixed in software. So I hope Vivo can further improve its stabilization algorithm next. As for the ultra-wide camera on this phone, I would say it's kind of okay. Since the focus of the V series has always been on the main camera and the front-facing camera, I won't have too high expectations for the ultra-wide camera. Looking at the sample images, it's quite clear that the ultra-wide doesn't look as nice as the main camera, and the white balance isn't as accurate either. It seems like the white balance always has some sort of green tint to it, which doesn't make the image look very natural. But at least it's a usable ultra-wide camera, and it gets the job done when it needs to. Speaking of the macro lens, it's honestly just a potato, and the images it produces are also kind of potatoes, so don't expect too much from its lens. Moving on to the front-facing camera. This time we have a selfie camera that supports autofocus, and more specifically, eye autofocus. This is quite interesting because selfie cameras on other phones usually have a fixed focus, meaning that sometimes your selfie shots will be a little bit out of focus. With autofocus though, that won't be an issue anymore. I tested this by moving closer to and further away from the front-facing camera, and I managed to get a pretty consistent focus on my face. If you notice the differences in the amount of background blur, it's a sign that the autofocus is actually working. Most importantly, the V25 Pro supports eye autofocus. Since our eyes are the most important part of a portrait or a selfie shot, this function is pretty important, and I find it pretty reliable because the phone can still focus on my eyes at a closer distance. I also tried covering one of my eyes, and the autofocus just jumped right to the other eye. Furthermore, you can enable and customize the focusing animation, just to make things more interesting. There are also beauty options for the front-facing camera. One of them is an AI HD algorithm. Vivo claims that it can improve face clarity and image quality through AI algorithms and the new hardcore technologies. And in my test, I found the effect to be quite subtle. It seems like turning it on will add more clarity and contrast to the image, thus making the face pop out a little more, but the amount is very minimal. At the same time, the selfie camera also supports real-time beauty filters while in video mode. However, it maximizes at 1080p 30 frames per second, which some people might find useful. Finally, let's talk about nighttime photography. Since the main camera now supports OIS, we can get more stable shots when shooting handheld for long exposures. Here is a handheld nighttime long exposure shot that I took for 8 seconds, and it looks pretty nice. However, it is not perfect. For example, in this shot, while the photo looks quite clear and sharp, the exposure is not consistent across the entire image, and the result looks like someone just bent the image and left a trace behind. Despite the fact that it is not perfect, having the option to shoot long exposure shots does enable more possibilities in terms of creativity, such as light traces. But I'm not very good at this, so just take this as an example. As for nighttime videos, the V25 Pro also has Super Night Video mode for low light environments. At first, I didn't really see a difference after enabling this mode, Then I found out that it's designed more for even darker interior environments. Now we can see a clear difference between normal video mode and super night video mode. But the downside is that you can only shoot in 1080p at 30 frames per second. So that's pretty much it for the vivo V25 Pro. What do you think of this phone? Let me know in the comments down below. If you want to see similar phones but from a different brand, then you can check out this video right here. For tech and gadgets, we got you covered. And I'll see you next time.